Hello everybody and welcome to the introduction for the Organic Chemistry 1 course that I am putting together online. So this introduction is going to be a pretty brief video. We're going to talk about carbon and organic chemistry, how the two are related, because certainly carbon is one of the important focal points, if not the main focal point of organic chemistry. And this is part of my Chem Complete series. This is the first video in the organic chemistry series, which will be followed up by hybridization, which is the first two lessons. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so what is organic chemistry, if we're going to do sort of a broad sense with organic chemistry in this topic? The study of compounds that contain carbon. So I think most people, even before they get to organic chemistry, have a general idea that organic chemistry is focused and centered around carbon. And a lot of times it used to be called chemistry of life or chemistry of living systems. And that's because we find a lot of organic compounds coming from within living systems. There used to be a theory called vitalism, which has certainly been outdated along with alchemy and several other things. But vitalism used to be the idea that living compounds had some sort of special vital force that they imparted into any molecule within the living compound. And then they basically, that was the beginning of organic chemistry, was vitalism. And it's a lot more scientific now than that. So what is it that makes carbon so special? That's one of the things we want to try to figure out here. All right. So carbon is special because it's unique in period 2. So when we're talking about period 2, if you go across period 1, you've got hydrogen and helium. Period 2, you start with lithium. You end up with neon. Okay? And if you go all the way across period 2, you're going to find that carbon is the only one in that group, and those are some of the most abundant elements on Earth: oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, etc. Carbon is the only one that has the ability to form 4 bonds. Now, I don't want to say carbon's the only element that can form 4 bonds. Silicon, as well as anything else in group 4A, has that ability. But carbon is definitely the most present out of those. You're going to find it the most in the universe compared to the other 4A elements. And in abundance, you're going to get a variety of compounds. Now, this is special, its ability to form 4 bonds. And you can see the Lewis structure. So hopefully you guys are familiar with Lewis structures. I've got the 4 electrons that surround the carbon. But this is special because it leads to a wide array of structures. And these structures are very rich in carbon. So you get rings. If you've ever seen something like cholesterol, for example, testosterone or something like that, if you look at the molecule, it's lots and lots of carbon rings that are linked together. If you take a look at gasoline, when you talk about octane, octane is an 8-membered carbon chain. And these carbons chain off of one another, and then they will add other various, sometimes we call them functional groups, so they might add an oxygen of some sort, but most of them tend to have hydrogens a lot of the time. But the point of this is that carbon gives a very rich source of compounds because of its versatility. We can make a lot of different bonds to carbon, in comparison to, let's say I take something like fluorine, right? Fluorine has 7 electrons. 3 of them are paired as lone pairs. It only has 1 left that's open for bonding. And so I have a very limited number of molecules that I can create with fluorine. So I could have HF, hydrofluoric acid. That's very nasty stuff, okay? I could have LF, lithium fluoride. There are certainly compounds that I could make with fluorine, but I'm going to have a limited number of compounds if I'm taking fluorine as my starting point. Okay. So we've been talking about carbon and carbon-based life. So 2 main points I want to make here. Number 1, carbon is essential for fuel and energy-based sources for living organisms. Now, not always for living organisms, sometimes just for man-made machinery. For instance, a lawnmower or a car, we were just talking about octane, right? It runs on an organic fuel. But human beings, along with primarily all other living systems on the planet, utilize fuel sources from carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Those are the macronutrients, okay? And if you take a look at the structure of basic carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, they all are carbon-based when we take a look at them. So Human beings do not go around eating large bowls of sodium chloride or large bowls of iron metal. It's not that we don't need certain minerals in our diet. We do. You need iron for hemoglobin. You need calcium for your bones. So we do need metals in our diet, but very small amounts, and they're not very energy rich in comparison to our body's need for carbohydrates, fats, and proteins in order to break down and obtain fuel. And number two, carbon is essential to life itself. So we also find carbon in DNA when we look at the nucleic acids. So hopefully you guys have had some sort of a biology course or something. We're talking about A, T, C, and G, right? When we have the 4 main amino acids. Sometimes you're talking about U in place of T, depending on if you're dealing with RNA, DNA, things like that. But the nucleic acids, if you take a look at those 1 and 2 ring structures, the bases on the nucleic acids have carbons. They have nitrogens and oxygens as well, but they are carbon-based, the bulk of the rings. And amino acids, because we talk about proteins in the diet as a source of energy, but proteins are also important within the body. We have different proteins that will allow different functions in our body. And so we talk about, you can get very complex with proteins. We're talking about just the amino acids. Then they can fold. We can get the beta sheets, the alpha helix, and tertiary quaternary structures, etc. But very important, carbon to life. So what other atoms do we find in organic chemistry? We certainly put carbon at the center. Right after that, the runner-up, and hopefully you've been sort of gathering this as we've been talking, is hydrogen. You will oftentimes hear the term hydrocarbon in reference to fats, fuels, things like that. Hydrocarbons are carbon chains that have a bunch of hydrogens on them. And then we get a lot of different functional groups. So we will have our own lecture on that, but oxygen, nitrogen, the halogens, and sulfur, those atoms make up a very rich source of functionality within the organic compound. So we can get alcohols, ketones, carboxylic acids, esters. I mean, I could name a bunch of them and just sit here all day naming, different functional groups. But these are probably in this order, the most common atoms that you would see. So carbon and hydrogen, I would put oxygen as number 3, especially with all the C double bond O compounds you'll come across. We'll talk about that later. Nitrogen is the runner-up right after that. Very often found in organic compounds. The halogens, not quite so much, but they're definitely there. You will see halogens on, hydrocarbon chains and things like that. And sulfur, even less so. Sulfur is still present. I don't want to say that it's not, but especially in undergraduate curriculums, you tend to see the halogens appearing more often than sulfur, and that's primarily due to the reactivity of the halogens. They make excellent what we call leaving groups, and we'll have a lecture on, reactions with halogens at some point. All right, so options for drawing organic compounds. We will go through this in more detail around when we get into like lesson 5 or 6 probably, as I'm breaking this apart. It's usually in chapter 3 or thereabout in most textbooks. But you have different options for representing your organic compounds. So you have a classic Lewis structure up here. I'm creating my carbons. Note that I'm not really worried about my geometry here. I'm keeping all these at right angles instead of 109.5, which would be the proper angle. But this is a generalized Lewis structure, and when you're starting out, this is completely fine. You want to get in the habit of knowing how many hydrogens each carbon should have and what other groups, when we start to talk about functional groups. Then we have a condensed structure. So in order of this page, this is probably the least common, and the line skeletal structure is the most common. As far as what you will see in everyday life when you start picking up research papers, textbooks, things like that. Lewis structures, it gets very, very long and monotonous to sit and write these out by hand with all the formal bonds in them. Condensed structures you will see quite a bit. I mean, you will see them more often than Lewis structures. So what I have up here is 5 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They have the proper number of hydrogens on them. By the way, carbon should never have more than 5 bonds, and we'll talk about that a little more in the hybridization chapter. So the condensed structure, I'm taking this first carbon here that has 3 hydrogens, and I'm writing CH3. And then it's implied that it's attached to this next carbon, which is CH2, and so on and so forth. I can walk down the chain. You might also see it how I have in the bottom here. CH3 and then CH2 in parentheses with a 4 next to it, and that's telling me that I get to insert 4 CH2 groups in between here. And notice that the terminal carbons on the chain, terminal meaning the end of the chain, contain 3 hydrogens, whereas the internal carbons only contain 2 hydrogens because they have to link up to 2 other carbons, whereas the terminal only has to link up to 1 other carbon. Okay, and then finally the line bond skeletal structure. Again, by far the one you're going to see most often, especially as we get further and further into the course. It saves time to write it this way. Every single point, and you're going to see this in this sort of, a lot of students call it mountain valley, right? The mountain peaks and then the valleys that dip down in between. Every point that I can draw, including the points on the end right here, every point that I can draw here is considered a carbon. And we always imply the proper number of hydrogens. So when you're looking at this, you can imply, or you can infer, I guess you could say, that there are 3 of them here. There's 2 of them here, 2 of them here, 2 of them here, and 3 of them here. Okay, all of the hydrogens are implied. Anything else, if I wanted an oxygen in the middle, if I wanted to draw a bromine coming off of one of these, I have to explicitly show it if it's not a hydrogen. Okay, so what background do you need in organic chemistry? A couple of important things. You need the ability to draw proper Lewis structures. This is all Gen Chem stuff you should have gotten. You need an understanding of orbitals, especially S and P orbitals. We're mostly dealing with, again, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, things that are in group 1 or 2, or period 1 or 2, and those utilize S and P orbitals, not D or F orbitals. You need an understanding of electrons and polarity, so electronegativity, if you've heard of that term, you know, polar covalent bonding, things like that. And you should have a good grasp on molecular geometry, so tetrahedral, trigonal, planar, etc., and hybridization theory, which we will be talking about in quite a bit of detail over the next 2 lessons. So, the next lesson, a small preview. What's it going to contain? Introduction to hybridization theory. We're going to go over that. And then it's going to talk about sp3 carbons. So we're going to talk about sp3 hybridization, and then the one after that will be sp2 and sp hybridization. So thanks a lot for watching. Please remember to like the video if you found it helpful. You are welcome to comment if you have questions. Again, if it was helpful or if it wasn't helpful, if you have suggestions, you're welcome to leave those. Please do me a favor and subscribe if you find these Chem Complete series videos to be useful. And I have a link, it's like a website / blog that I'm going to be maintaining, and I will put that link in the description of this video so that you can make your way over to the site if you want more information. So thanks a lot for investing your time and education in me, and I hope to see you guys for the next lecture. Thanks a lot.